I was out shopping yesterday and I came across this plant that I wanted to buy. It's called pothos. You can see the kind of the green specks on there. I think it's a pretty cool plant. But my question was, what exactly am I supposed to do with this plant once I take it home? Do I just leave it in this pot? Am I supposed to buy a new one? Am I supposed to put it into a bigger pot, smaller pot, just leave it as is? What am I supposed to do? And that gave me the idea for this video. We're going to talk about how you can decide what kind of pot you should pick for your plants. And I came across 5 different factors you should consider when picking out a new pot for your plant. Okay, number one, first thing you should think about is how much you're going to water your plant. So there's 2 main types of pots that you want to look out for. One is the terracotta pots or the ceramic pots. The other is a plastic pot. And those are the 2 main types of pots that you're going to be seeing out there. So terracotta pot, it's like a ceramic pot. Basically the idea is as you water your plants, the water is supposed to soak into the terracotta pot or the ceramic pot through its little micropores and eventually evaporate out through the pots. And so it's a way for you to water your plants and having that excess water evaporate from the sides of the pot rather than being trapped inside as with a plastic pot. So with the plastic pot, the main thing that you'll see with those is that the water will actually be stuck inside. So once the water goes into the pot, into your plastic pot, that water just gets stuck inside there. It doesn't actually evaporate out. Water can't really pass through plastic. So that's why the first thing you want to think about is how much are you actually watering your plants? Because depending on how much you water your plant, that's going to help you make the choice between a terracotta pot or a plastic pot. If you're someone who really loves to water your plants all day, every day, then you're going to want to go with a terracotta pot or some kind of ceramic pot. So something like this, it's a kind of a ceramic type of feel. You'll probably see them when you're out shopping for pots. And basically, if you're watering your plants a lot, the terracotta pot is supposed to mitigate that excess moisture by allowing it to evaporate out the sides of the pot. And that can be really handy if you're someone who likes to water your plants a lot, because that means you're not going to, or there's lower risk of overwatering your plants. On the other hand, if you're someone who is really low maintenance, you don't want to water your plants all that much, then I would recommend you go with a plastic pot, because once you water your plant, that water is going to stay stuck inside of the pot. And if you're someone who doesn't water as frequently, maybe that's something that you want, because that means that you don't have to go back in and water your plants to replace the water that has evaporated from the soil. So how much you water your plant is probably the first thing I would consider to make the choice between ceramic pots or plastic pots. And that's the first thing I would think about. And that's going to cut your choices in half, make it a little bit easier for you to filter out what type of pot you're looking for. Okay, another factor you want to think about is whether you're going to place your plant indoors or outdoors. So if you place your plant outdoors, it's going to be exposed to a lot of sun, and what that means is water is going to evaporate much more quickly than if that plant were indoors. Even placing a plant just outside your window versus placing it just inside your window is going to make a huge difference in terms of how much water is going to be retained in your soil between waterings. So if your plant is outside, that's going to mean more water is going to evaporate from your soil, and maybe you want to pick a plastic pot, and that will help retain some of that moisture a little bit more so you don't have to go out and water it as much. On the other hand, if it's indoors, maybe you want to stick with a terracotta pot, because that means you can give it a little bit more water and there's less risk of having that water stagnate and causing root rot or your plants being overwatered. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to choose one or the other, but that's just another factor that you might want to consider. A rule of thumb that I've seen from my research is that keeping your plants outdoors is going to cause water to evaporate about 2 or 3 times as fast as a plant that is kept indoors. And a plant that is kept in a terracotta pot is going to evaporate 2 to 3 times faster than a plant that is kept in a plastic pot. So if you want to compare a terracotta pot that's kept outside, that's going to evaporate 4 to 6 or 7 times more than a plant that is kept indoors with a plastic pot. So just something to think about when you're picking out your plant pot. Okay, the third thing we want to talk about here is the weight. In case it wasn't really obvious, plastic weighs less than a ceramic pot, ceramic or terracotta pot. And that can make a noticeable difference if you're going to be moving your plants around a lot, especially if your plant is a really big plant. So if you have a huge plant where you have to like wrap your arms around the pot to lift it up and move it places, having a ceramic or a terracotta pot is going to make that really heavy to move around. So maybe a plastic pot will make it a little bit easier on yourself if you have to move your plants around. Smaller plants is probably not going to make too huge of a difference. But where it might come into play is if you're trying to weigh your plants to determine if it's been watered enough, if it has enough water. So one thing a lot of people like to do, one way that they'll check if their plant needs water is to just pick it up and just kind of feel it, feel how much it weighs, to kind of get a rough idea of how much water is in that soil. About 60 to maybe 80% of the weight that is going to be in your plant is going to come from water that's held in the soil. Once you get enough experience watering your plants and kind of feeling the weight, that's going to be an easy way to tell whether or not your plant needs water. When it comes to play with the terracotta pots or the plastic pots, having a plastic pot is going to mean that it's going to be more noticeable to feel that distinction between having plenty of water versus needing more water. Basically, a plastic pot means that more of that weight that you're going to feel is going to be from the presence or absence of water, versus a terracotta pot, it's going to be a lot of it is going to be the ceramic material, and so it'll be a little bit more difficult to feel how heavy your plant is and how much of that is from having water or not having enough water. That's just another thing to keep in mind when you're selecting your pots. If you want to feel it, if you want to have an easier time weighing your plant or moving it around, or you just want to use it as a way to feel if your plant's been watered or not, I would say plastic probably wins in this case over a ceramic pot. Plus, it's also going to mean that shipping prices are going to be lower, just because shipping things that are larger are generally going to cost less in shipping and handling. Just another thing to think about. All right, the fourth factor that you might want to consider is the type of plant that you have. In case you didn't know this already, different plants have different watering requirements. So some plants need a lot of water, some plants really don't need much water at all. So with something like a snake plant, these guys don't really need that much water. Sticking with a plastic pot means that you're going to be at a greater risk of overwatering your plants, because more water is going to be retained in that soil versus evaporating out and allowing the soil to be a little bit more dry in between waterings. Whereas a terracotta pot, that excess moisture is a lot of it's going to evaporate out the sides, and so there's a little bit less risk of overwatering your plants. But on the other hand, if you have a plant that really loves water, then maybe it might make more sense to stick with a plastic pot, because that means that water is going to be held within that pot and none of it's going to evaporate out. And that means your plant is going to have more water overall in between waterings. And so that might actually be beneficial to you. A lot of that talk was about terracotta versus plastic pot, kind of like the different types of material, the two main types of materials you want to consider. The other thing that I want to talk about is the size of your pot. The size of your pot is going to determine how big your plant is going to grow and the speed at which it's going to grow into that space. So the thing with pot size is if you have a bigger pot, that means that there's more space for the roots to expand and navigate and grow into the soil. And that also means that your plant is going to have more nutrients, more energy to devote to growing. And it has just more space overall to grow. And so in the end, your plant is going to grow bigger and larger and probably faster than if it were kept in a smaller pot. So if you want to keep your plants really small, maybe you don't want it to grow too big, maybe you just want it to stay a certain size to keep that specific aesthetic you're looking for, or you don't want it to take up too much space in your house, maybe you want to stick with a smaller pot that's going to kind of restrict and limit the growth that your plant is going to see. But if you want a plant that's going to grow huge and take up a lot of space, you might want to think about putting it into a bigger pot. Maybe after you start noticing that your plant is starting to stall a little bit in its growth. Maybe at that point you might want to consider repotting it and putting it into a bigger pot so that it can continue to grow larger and fuller. So that's pretty much it in terms of what type of material and what size you want to pick for your pot. So there's mainly like two materials that I covered, plastic and ceramics, but those are really the two things that are going to matter. The material, the weight, the size. Pretty much if you look at those factors, that's going to help you choose whether or not a pot is going to be worth looking at for your plant. Maybe you want to think about a metal pot or maybe even some kind of glass vase. I would say those two are probably more along the lines of plastic in terms of keeping the water retained in the soil, but more similar to terracotta pots or ceramic pots in terms of the weight. They're going to be a little bit more heavier. Using those guidelines, that's probably going to give you enough of a guide to picking out your own pot for your plants. Just really quick, one thing that I want to with these pots is that you want to look for something that has drainage holes. That's going to help make sure that water doesn't pool or congregate at the bottom of the soil, which could cause root rots and overwatering your plants. Ideally, you want to pick a pot that has drainage holes at the bottom. You can also drill those drainage holes yourself if your particular pot doesn't have those drainage holes already. So a lot of nursery pots, the kind of pots that you get when you're picking out your plants, will already come with drainage holes. So if you look at the bottom of this pot here, you'll see that there's some holes at the bottom here. And these are going to be where excess water is going to drain out of the pot. And that's going to come in handy when you're actually watering your plants. Because basically what you're looking for when you're watering your plants is that you water it enough so that enough water comes out of the bottom of your pot. And it's also going to be necessary if you want to actually bottom water your plants. Maybe I'll make another video about that. But basically how it works is you stick your plant with its pot into a tray of water or something, or into some kind of larger bowl of some sort with water in it. And you're just going to stick your plant in there with those drainage holes, and that water is going to actually seep up through those drainage holes into the soil. And that's actually a great way to avoid fungus gnats, because that top layer isn't going to be all wet and moist and really ripe for the harvesting for those fungus gnats. And it's also just a great way to water your plants to make sure that entire soil is saturated with water, because sometimes if your soil hasn't been watered for a long time, it can get all dry and clumped up. And so when you water your plant, when it's like that, that water is just going to flow over it like it was a solid block of rock or something. But when you bottom water your plants, that water is actually going to seep through and break up that soil a little bit and hydrate the entire soil rather than just passing over it. So that's pretty much it about how you're going to decide what type of pot you're going to choose for your plants. If I wanted to just give a really sweeping generalization here, I would recommend you pick a plastic pot, because generally those are going to be cheaper. It's really easy to cut out drainage holes if you don't have them already. They're also really light. And I really like the fact that you don't have to water your plant as much, because that water is going to stay in the soil for a long period of time, rather than evaporating super quickly. And then you have to keep watering your plants like more often, and it's just going to be more work for you. That's pretty much it for this video. If you like that, if that helped you out, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.